gas lines stretching for blocks, double-digit inflation. By the late 1970s, the American economy was sputtering, and the post-war boom felt like a distant memory. Fast forward a few decades, and you look at a different landscape. The United States emerges as an interconnected digital superpower in a unipolar world. To bridge the gap between those two realities on your AP exam, you cannot rely on memorizing a chronological list of presidents. Knowing exactly when Bush or Clinton held office will not help you write an effective essay on the specific ways the country changed. Instead, we must map the modern era across a three-axis coordinate system. The first vector tracks the conservative political resurgence and neoliberal economics. The second vector tracks massive demographic realignment within the country. The third vector charts the geopolitical pivot toward the war on terror. Period 9 is the result of these three vectors colliding. Master that intersection, and you have the structural framework needed to handle every DBQ and FRQ for the modern era. In 1980, voters handed the presidency to Ronald Reagan, establishing a new baseline for American politics. He summarized the animating ethos of this conservative resurgence in his inaugural address. Government was not the solution to the economic crisis. Government was the problem. For decades, the New Deal consensus relied on Keynesian economics, utilizing federal spending to drive consumer demand. The new conservative coalition abandoned this model, targeting the supply side of the economy instead. This flowchart tracks supply-side economics. The administration slashed income taxes for corporations and the wealthiest Americans. By letting them keep more capital, they would reinvest in businesses, driving job creation and allowing wealth to trickle down to the working class. But while the administration reduced incoming tax revenue to stimulate the market, they simultaneously authorized a massive expansion in federal spending to build up the military. This graph tracks the mathematical consequence of that dual approach. By cutting revenue and increasing defense budgets simultaneously, the federal deficit more than tripled during the 1980s. At the same time, the administration systematically dismantled federal oversight across multiple industries. Stripped of costly regulatory hurdles, corporate profits surged and the stock market saw significant gains. Yet the promised trickle-down effect failed to materialize for the average worker. Throughout this period of rising corporate wealth, middle and working class wages remained stagnant. The conservative economic shift successfully engineered massive capital generation for the corporate elite, but structurally embedded a widening income gap and a permanent national debt into the American system. This domestic policy shift collided with rapid technological advancement. Hardware originally developed for the military, like microchips and early internet protocols, were commercialized, transitioning the United States out of heavy manufacturing and into a digital knowledge economy. This technological evolution aligned with a global push toward neoliberalism. World leaders aggressively deregulated industries, lowered international trade barriers, and prioritized free market competition across borders. Treaties like the North American Free Trade Agreement and organizations like the World Trade Organization provided the legal mechanisms to integrate the United States into this globalized corporate network. This integration triggered backlash at home. Labor organizers and environmentalists mounted fierce protests, warning that these transnational agreements empowered corporations to bypass local labor laws and exploit cheaper workforce markets abroad. Those warnings largely proved accurate. As American corporations outsourced their manufacturing to developing nations to maximize efficiency, domestic industrial workers lost their jobs by the millions, crippling the power of organized labor. Because representation in the House of Representatives is tied directly to state population, this migration triggered an immediate constitutional mechanism. When states lose residents, they lose political power. This map visualizes the transfer. Electoral college votes and House seats steadily drained out of the Rust Belt, leaving states like Michigan and Ohio with diminished influence. Those seats were reassigned to growing Sunbelt power centers like Texas, Florida, and California. By tracking the population data, the political reality becomes clear. The nation's center of gravity relocated to the south and west, ensuring modern politics would be dominated by Sunbelt demographics and economies. Internal migration was only half the demographic story. By 1980, the United States began experiencing the delayed effects of the 1965 Immigration Act, resulting in a massive spike in foreign-born populations from Latin America and Asia. This influx reignited debates over American identity. Citizens clashed over whether new arrivals should culturally assimilate into a single uniform identity or whether the country should embrace multiculturalism. You can see this cultural friction clearly in the battles over public education, where the implementation of English as a second language programs became a major political flashpoint regarding what it meant to belong in America. The growing Asian American population faced an additional unique pressure during this era, the widespread application of the model minority stereotype. Praising Asian immigrants for high standardized test scores and quiet obedience seemed positive on the surface, but it was frequently used by the majority culture as a political wedge to criticize Black Americans and dismiss the ongoing grievances of the civil rights movement. The label placed intense, unrealistic psychological expectations on Asian communities, while actively obscuring the structural inequalities that many new immigrants faced upon arrival. Driven by these demographic shifts, the late 20th century forced the United States into a continuous renegotiation of what constitutes the American identity. Overseas, the American posture was also shifting. Under the Reagan Doctrine, the United States abandoned the defensive strategy of containing communism. Instead, the government actively sought to roll it back, funneling money and weapons to anti-communist insurgents around the globe. The administration also escalated the arms race through the Strategic Defense Initiative. This massive financial and technological investment in space-based weapons was designed specifically to bankrupt the stagnant Soviet economy, which could no longer afford to keep pace. The pressure worked. To save their collapsing system, Soviet leadership under Mikhail Gorbachev introduced internal economic restructuring and political openness, but loosening the state's grip only accelerated its fracture. By 1989, citizens were physically tearing down the Berlin Wall, dismantling the Iron Curtain piece by piece, and effectively concluding the bipolar Cold War era. When the Soviet Union officially dissolved in 1991, the United States stood alone. President George H.W. Bush declared a new world order, anchored by the world's sole unchallenged superpower. The Persian Gulf War proved exactly how that power would be used. When Iraq threatened global oil supplies by invading Kuwait, the U.S. deployed overwhelming military force, not to fight a communist ideology, but to protect global economic interests. The collapse of the Soviet state did not end American military intervention. It simply changed the justification from existential survival to policing the stability of a unipolar global economy. That posture of confident economic policing shattered on September 11, 2001. The devastating terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon instantly rendered the policies of the 1990s obsolete. In response, President George W. Bush established a doctrine that marked a severe historical departure. The United States would no longer wait for an imminent threat to retaliate. It claimed the right to strike preemptively. This logic drove the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Asserting that the Iraqi government possessed weapons of mass destruction, the military dismantled the regime, locking the United States into prolonged ground wars in the Middle East. The war on terror had equally severe domestic consequences. The passage of the Patriot Act expanded the federal government's authority, legalizing the mass collection of civilians' digital metadata in the name of national security. Congress then executed the largest reorganization of the federal bureaucracy in history, consolidating dozens of agencies to create the Department of Homeland Security. September 11th moved the American state into a posture of perpetual military readiness, committing the military to preemptive global conflicts while building an expansive surveillance apparatus at home. Returning to our initial coordinate system, we map how these vectors interact. Conservative deregulation accelerated a globalized tech economy, hollowing out the Rust Belt and driving populations into the Sunbelt. Meanwhile, the war on terror's geopolitical pivot collided with tax cuts, generating massive structural deficits. Which leads us to the defining historical paradox of Period 9. A political movement won the presidency in 1980 by explicitly promising to shrink the size and scope of the federal government. Yet by the 21st century, that same government had built a sprawling domestic surveillance state, waged multi-decade global wars, and accumulated a staggering national debt. To master this era on your exam, stop treating it as a list of presidents. Argue the intersections, follow the money, track the migration, and map the geopolitics. That is how you analyze the structural trajectory of the modern United States.